a little bit longer and the feed is delayed.
Yeah, take your time.
All right, it looks like everything's working, so.
Hey.
We're going to check it and make sure it's working, but hopefully we are live on Facebook as well as on Zoom. And I see that our Zoom audience is starting to arrive. And I want to welcome everybody. See some familiar names here in the sidebar. Did you get a good lightning storm up there last night?
A bit of one. It was, yeah, we did, but it was short.
Yeah, it was intense here. It was more heat lightning than.
Yes, exactly. Yep. But when you're on the bay here, it's so broad. I mean, the weather changes. There's about probably 110 paintings an hour. You know, it just changes all the time. Yeah.
That's great. Well, welcome to Zoom. If you want to let us know where you're calling in from, that would be great. And similarly on Facebook, those of you joining us on Facebook, I see got Connecticut there. We'll see. Yeah, calling in local from the Distillery District in Toronto.
Aha.
Minnesota.
A well-known place these days.
Yeah, St. Lawrence neighborhood. So the way we're going to handle questions on both Zoom and Facebook is I will moderate. So I'll ask the questions and decide which ones to ask because we're running on two platforms right now. So we'll make it easy for you. And of course, this session is about travel and it is about exploring Toronto. So we're going to stay tight to that topic and leverage your perspective to get some insider tips on Toronto and also learn a lot. So that's the goal of this. And yeah, great. So let me just start for people that may not know much about JourneyWoman. We'll get that out of the way so that we can get into the good stuff. My name is Carolyn Ray, and I'm the publisher and CEO of JourneyWoman. And JourneyWoman is a women's travel magazine and website and community that's been around for almost 30 years. It was founded in 1994 by Evelyn Hannon, who was also from Toronto and was really regarded as one of the first solo travelers, female solo travelers in the world. She passed away last year and her family invited me to take this business over and continue to grow it and expand it. So that's what I've been working on for the last year is all things JourneyWoman. And we just launched a new website about 6 weeks ago, I guess. And based on all the feedback from our community. So I invite you to take a look at that and see what interests you. And we know that even now, if we can't travel, we can still be thinking about travel and we can still be inspired by travel. And of course, science tells us that half of the joy of traveling is anticipating when you would take the trip and all the things you could do to plan and prepare for it. So we've been holding a number of live sessions like this for the last 3 months or so. And we've been doing sessions on bravery and courage and looking at different destinations like Italy. We have a book club that runs, that is having its first session on June 10th, and we're going to be talking about Portugal. And then we have other sessions in July. We're doing Ireland and Spain. So reading books associated with Ireland and Spain. So and then we also have another session coming up in a few weeks that's going to look at ethical travel and how we can interact with animals and wildlife in a sustainable way. So all of those are coming our way. And today is a new series that we call Travel at Home, because we know that we're all somewhat limited right now, especially in North America, in terms of where we can travel. And what we wanted to do was invite experts like Mr. David Crombie, the Honourable David Crombie, to join us and give us some tips on how we can really get to know cities and places in a different way. And it also gives us a chance to practice our curiosity and perhaps look at something with a new perspective. So I'm very honored that David said yes when I asked him if he would do this for us, because not only have I had the absolute joy of getting to know him through Museum of Toronto, which we're both involved with, I think he is just an extraordinary leader, and I think you'll have a wonderful time with him over the next hour, learning from him. We also normally don't invite men, David, so this is kind of special too for that reason. Anyways, I know that most people have probably read through your bio. You've certainly led a life of service to Canada and to Toronto. You were the 56th mayor of Toronto in the 1970s. You've served as minister at the federal level, Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, National Health, also Secretary of State. However, today's discussion is not intended to be a political discussion. It's intended to be a discussion around some of the work that you've also done around protecting green spaces, preserving history in Toronto, and things like that. So that's where we're going to put most of our focus today. And of course, we'll take questions as we go through the next few minutes together. I also live very close to a park that's named after you, so I get to think of you every time I walk by David Crombie Park. So again, thank you again for joining us today. And we thought we'd just start off with a few quick facts about Toronto for those who may not live in Canada. It is the fourth largest city in North America and growing quite rapidly. Most of the people coming to Toronto now are not born in Canada, so we have a very diverse, inclusive city here. And the city is about 186 years old. But of course, its history, and I think you're going to talk about some of that today, goes well beyond 1834, I believe, is when it was officially incorporated. So David, let's start talking a little bit about you. And I know you grew up, you were born in Toronto, and you grew up in a small neighborhood near High Park, which is one of our beautiful green spaces. What was that like, and what was a memory of growing up there that you could share with us?
Well, it's in my time living there, it was my boyhood, and it was actually its own village. It was not a Toronto neighborhood at that time. It was its own village. The village of Swansea, 1 square mile, bounded on 3 sides by water, Grenadier Pond, which is at High Park, the Humber River, and Lake Ontario, and on the north simply by Bloor Street, one of the long streets, east-west streets in Toronto. So it had a sense of separateness, and for me, my parents were also raised there. My grandparents came there, and so for me, it was a place of family. It was a place of understanding community. It was a warm place, and in my heart, I still walk through the place. I go to some of its ritual things like Remembrance Day on November the 11th and so on every year, because what it did do, and as I got older, I had not, of course, realized the benefit that it gave to me other than a warm family feeling. But it taught me a lot about the sort of rudiments of community, taught me a lot about the importance of nature, even in a large urban area. It taught me a lot about the importance of public institutions that we rely on for services and so on. So many of the things that I encountered later on in the city of Toronto as its mayor and other venues, it's interesting to me that it always took me back to Swansea. So Swansea became less a place, more a metaphor, more. So there's a line somewhere in the Great White Whale, Melville, Moby Dick. Couldn't think of it. Yeah. In Moby Dick, one of his heroes talks about the best places you won't find them on the map, because they actually become invested with your own interest, your own thoughts, your own views, your own understanding. So the Swansea that I came from is not necessarily the Swansea that I walked through when I was 10 years old.
Yeah, yeah. And you're writing a book as well about your.
Yeah, it's more a book. It's not a book. It's not a memoir. People call it that because that's a short form. But it's a book really about 1945 Toronto. It's a history of Toronto as I saw it and see it between 1945, and I'm arrogant enough to take it right through to 2041. And so it's all of that period, and I'm going to try and intro it by writing something about Swansea. I've tried a number of times. It's always easier to write about things you know less about. The more you know about them, the more drafts you have to do.
Yes, true enough. And I'm curious, when you became mayor, I mean, obviously the 1970s were a period of intense change in the city. What are you most proud of from that time?
Well, it really was a major change time, and we didn't invent the change. The change came upon us, and it was how we reacted to it that became defining moments for I think Toronto's future. So the things that we have to, I don't go into too far into the weeds, but Toronto at that time was undergoing major change in terms of its planning and development. And so we were following what we called in those days the American model. The notion was that suburbs were being built, that's where people lived, and people by and large could work downtown, most of them worked downtown, and they used automobiles and expressways to connect the two. That was the basic model that you found in North America, other parts of Europe as well, but certainly in North America. We, in my generation in Toronto at that time, fought against that. And so the first fight we had was whether or not one of the expressway development should be, which was happening everywhere in North America, there should be an expressway into the core of the city. We opposed that because we saw what happened to Buffalo, saw what happened to Troy, saw all those places. So we opposed it and won. We stopped the Spadina Expressway and the Midtown Expressway, and those victories allowed us to transform Toronto in a different way than other North American cities, mostly. Secondly, we had a downtown which was also going the way of downtowns and in North America, and that was that they were becoming vacated. So we fought very hard to bring in a downtown plan, which we brought in 1976, which lasted for the next 35 years with amendments, and that defined the way in which we had a vital downtown. Thirdly, housing. Just as today, big issues of not only affordable, but any kind of housing. And so we worked in ways in which we had both neighborhood housing and large developments, the flagship of which is a park you mentioned earlier, Lawrence Park or Lawrence neighborhood. That was industrial junk space when in 1970s, but within 5 years, we were able to all co-op. All of those are co-op buildings except one, and that's for 10,000 people. So it was a very extensive housing project. So I think there are other things that other people might point out, deficiencies as well as victories, but those were the three major things which had a defining importance for the future of Toronto.
Yeah. And because we want to talk about looking at a city in a different way today, how do you think people can be more curious when they travel, and what are some things that you do when you look at cities and you look at places?
I love going to cities, any city, doesn't matter where it is in the world. And what I try and do, like anybody else, I read all the literature that comes from those travel agents, from those kinds of people. But then I try and get deeper a little bit, dive a little deeper into other literature that might be written. I find good literature describes things easier, fiction even. I'm not talking about instruction, talking about, for example, if you're coming to Toronto, then you're really worthwhile reading 3 or 4, I might say, women authors who have defined much of what Toronto's about, and they focused on the ravines of Toronto, for example. So the first thing to do, I think, is always to be prepared to to find out what other people are saying about where you're going. But then secondly, I think it really is important to me. I remember a line from a guy by the name of Hayakawa. He was, I think, president of San Francisco University. He's a Canadian from British Columbia. And he wrote a wonderful book called Language in Thought and Action. And in it, he said, you always have to remember the map is not the territory. Right. So it's really important to read as much as you can, understand it, but then get on your boots and walk, or if you have to, as close as you can to walking, absorb it. The more you walk, the more your mind gets into 3 miles an hour, and the more you can actually understand.
Yeah, yeah. And you've talked to me about bone structure of a city. Could you describe that idea a little bit?
Oh, sure. I mean, all cities have a basic bone structure. It's usually their natural heritage. And I can take you to almost any city in the United States, for example, that I would know. And if you start with their bone structure, you'll find out how their community developed, how their philosophy developed, how their bright moments developed, all of that by paying attention in Toronto, to their bone structure. The bone structure for Toronto is the waterfront and the ravines. Now, that doesn't mean we honored both of those throughout our lifetime. No, we've ruined it, we built it, we've brought it back, we've heard it, we've nurtured it. But in Toronto, it's the waterfront and the ravines. We have 300 kilometers of ravines in Toronto alone. For many generations, people forgot them. And so now people are trying to bring them back. But at any rate, if I was going to lead a tour and people were wanted to, I would say, put on some good boots. It's not a painful thing. We'll go where we need to go, but I would take you up the Humber Valley Ravine, which is a ravine. I would take you up the Don. I would take you, there are half a dozen lovely ravines. And it's now topped off by it's going to be one of the great tourist attractions in North America, and that's the Rouge Park. The Rouge Park, which is on the Rouge River, the Rouge Valley, is a park, and it's Canada's first national urban park, because more and more people are staying in cities. So it is the very first one. It's only a year old, but the space, to give you a sense of it, goes right down from Lake Ontario to the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is a high point of land in the north part of Toronto. It is 4 times larger than Central Park in New York. It is 16 times larger than Stanley Park in Vancouver. And it's far more rugged than both of those in terms of wildlife, in terms of animal species, in terms of vegetation and all of that. So I would take you to the ravines. If you go along the waterfront, you will also discover Toronto's history and economic history, its community history, all of that. So in all of these, even when you take a nature walk, you are learning and can learn what the cultural heritage and the political heritage is as well. Anybody that simply thinks that natural heritage should be alone and enough, that may be for the purists. But for most of us, we found that if you combine natural heritage with cultural heritage, you've got a winner.
Yeah. And you played obviously a very important role founding the Waterfront Trail that runs all along Lake Ontario. Can you tell us a bit about that, and what are the key spots there that are important to you?
Oh, sure. I'll do it very quickly, but in 1988, I was asked by the federal government if I would carry out a Royal Commission on the future of the Toronto waterfront. And we made a series of recommendations, but we didn't only deal with the waterfront. All waterfronts are connected to watersheds. And so we took what we called a watershed approach, or bioregional approach. And so we made a series of recommendations to all levels of government. And then we were asked how we would start it, begin to implement it. And we began a thing known as the Waterfront Regeneration Trust, whose major project was to build a trail or bring trails together, develop a trail structure that was not simply for hike and bike and frolic and fun, but also to have people come down and say, why is this polluted? How can we fix this? So it's an ecological trail as well. It's now 3,000 kilometers. It goes from down in the south part to south end of Lake Erie up to the top of the Bruce Peninsula, and it also goes over up to St. Lawrence to the province of Quebec, where it connects with La Route Verte. So it's been going on. It's now 26 years this year. This year, in honor of the 25th year, we began to explore the I might say, by the way, it covers 3 lakes, not just Lake.
That's amazing. I had no idea how far.
Yeah, Lake Erie and Lake Huron, and it combines 140 different municipalities and First Nation communities. It's an extraordinary length, but what it does do as well is carry with it ecological functionings that need to be explored and dealt with by local municipalities. Our job is to connect them. So we do a lot of work. I might say, by the way, it's headed up by a woman by the name of Marlene Cooler, who I just take the bows and cut the ribbons. She does all the work. And they've done a great job for 25 years. At any rate, that's it. On the trail, what it's done is now moved us over to having it binational, because we have lots of Americans come on the trail. And so there's a wonderful organizations in the United States dealing with the Great Lakes as well. So it is now going to be a binational Great Lakes trail.
Oh, that's amazing. That's good to know. And you can bike the whole.
You can bike the whole thing. Sometimes it's on road, sometimes it's not. We call it a waterfront trail rather than a shoreline trail, because people used to say, "How long will this take, David?" And I used to say, 1,000 years? I don't know. Because as soon as you finish, you got to start again. Each new generation brings in new thoughts. So the whole idea is to get it going, and then people will discover how important it is to them. So when we started out, the land development industry was against us doing this because they didn't want us to their trail through their land. Mm-hmm. Now they're begging us to come because people understand the importance of the trail in their lifestyles.
Yeah, yeah. We both are on the board of Museum of Toronto, which is an organization that you, I think, envisioned for many years and was launched about 5 years ago. Tell us a bit about Toronto's history and what you think people in Toronto should know, or visiting Toronto outside of the everyday. I mean, we kind of have our traditional history, but then there's maybe some interesting tidbits that you could share about Toronto's history.
Yeah, and there is. For a long time, because we were part of the British Empire, and everybody thought it all began in 1793 when Lieutenant Colonel Simcoe established a fort on behalf of the British Empire to make sure those Americans didn't come across the line. And I think somehow that was the history that we got. But since then, we've, of course, rediscovered a whole other wonderful. So I did a series of lectures a year ago, and I started the history of Toronto the year 1500, because there's wonderful Indigenous people history from even before that, but certainly from 1500 on. So the Toronto area has been a place on this waterfront, born on the waterfront, because it was part of the trading routes of Aboriginal people or Indigenous people. And it's and what is known as the Toronto Passage goes up the Humber River, right in Toronto, on Toronto's waterfront. It connects the upper lakes to the lower lakes of the Great Lakes. So it was always a highway of trade, even long before the Europeans got here. It was also a place that was endowed with, invested with spiritual value, and was a meeting place for rituals. So it's always had that kind of cultural, economic, and community base to it. That moved quite smartly, of course. Big changes in the latter part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th, because of the 7 Years' War, and the French were gone, the American Revolution, the Americans were gone. So it's a whole. So I could go on, but it has a wonderful history before.
Yeah,
I think in many ways, because of the tremendous influx of people, and we've had immigration into this city long before the First World War, but since the First World War, it really exploded. And so the history of the place became the history as well of newcomers. We had to rediscover what we actually meant by the immigrant life. What's the story of the immigrant? Now,
Mhm.
interesting enough, it's a different notion than the American understanding, because the Americans had a strong need, and I understand it, to explain why people were Americans and not other things. We didn't have that need. We weren't even allowed the opportunity to have that need. So in a sense, our understanding of who we are came from a variety of sources made up by the people who came here, which is why we always understood immigration not to be something that happens where you're in a holding tank, you become something, right?
Right.
In fact, you are an agent of change. So the immigrants to Toronto have been for many, many decades now, and will continue to be the definers of what Toronto actually is, which is why it's a place that's never finished.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful. Well said. When we think about the history of our city here, as a resident, we often think of places like the Distillery or Fort York. Um, are there other, St. Lawrence Market would be another one. Are there other places in the city that you would suggest people visit to get a sense of the history that might be a little bit off the beaten track, or places you normally wouldn't go on a tour?
Well, my own way of doing it would be to take you along. If I was leading a tour, I would take
Yeah.
people along the waterfront, right?
Right.
And you can take that, you can do that for half an hour or 5 days. It's whatever you want to see. And I would be able to point out what the economic framework was. All change in Toronto begins in the waterfront, even to this day. Go down there today, it's not the waterfront that was there when I was a boy, right? Totally different. I mean, just totally different. I could go through what happened. And it happened in our time in the 60s and 70s, in my time at any rate, in the 60s and 70s. But that would be one. That would be one walk. Secondly, I would take any one of those valleys that I mentioned, because each one of them has their own story. In terms of institutions, it's interesting. If you're really looking for a walk to get your arms around what Toronto's institutions are about, go to the corner of Bloor Street and University Avenue, or University Avenue. Going north, it's Avenue Road. Going south, it's Queen's Park, right?
Right.
Now, if you go down there to Queen Street, it only takes you a half a day. You will find educational institutions, health institutions, academic institutions. You'll find places for poor people who need help. You'll find mental institutions. The whole panorama of the smorgasbord of services and institutions that people need to have community life, you'll find on that walk. So there are those kinds of places.
Yeah.
Go up to Queen's Park and walk through the halls. Don't take the tour. Take a tour because they're nice people, but wander around, and then come back with questions, because you'll see pictures of people. You'll see. At any rate, I would take any one of those. City Hall is worth taking. Go along. I'm sure to say, if you're really looking to see diversity in the city, you can still take the Queen Street car from beginning to end, from Long Branch to Neville Park, and you'll be able to see the decades-long immigration to the city and what it did to the existing neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's a wonderful idea, actually. And it
Yeah,
raises another question around.
It actually came from my mother, who had 4 kids and always wanted to figure out what to do with them at certain times. And she would give us at that time a nickel. We would walk down Ellis Avenue, get on the streetcar, go out to Neville Park, and come back, and that was half a day.
Yeah, it's a great idea, especially right now as we're starting to come out of our homes a little bit too.
Absolutely. So yes.
So the neighborhoods. So let's talk about the neighborhoods, because every city has its own unique neighborhoods. Do you have a favorite neighborhood in Toronto, or is there one?
I love them. I really do love them all. Some are more attractive than others. Some have people I like better than others. all of those kinds of things. But on the other hand, I have, and maybe from the Swansea roots, but also other neighborhoods that I know from my family. Wherever you go, the neighborhoods that work are those that make you feel that you belong to something. All neighborhoods answer 3 questions. Or at least they're. Well, let me put it another way. The Toronto experience, I think, says that neighborhoods are not simply physical places, they are psychic spaces. And they are psychic spaces that require or a place that people can find the answers to these three questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? And how do I behave? Now, I've been asking those questions since I was 3. I'm 84 and I'm still asking those questions because the answers keep changing. And the best place to find those answers, and very often the best and most comfortable answers, are in small places and spaces like neighborhoods. Yeah. That's why they're important.
Yeah, yeah. And if you were to take someone on your tour, perhaps along the Queen Street streetcars, are there neighborhoods that you would want to stop in, or places that you would?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's one out in the far west end called Mimico. It's an old working class district, a great lacrosse town, which was a great game years ago. Great lacrosse town, still Mimico. I would go there because it's totally changed, but there are still remnants of the way it was as a lakeshore community, but now it's a totally changed place. So you'd look at that. I would go out to the beach, or beaches, whatever they want to call it, out the east end, because it's got a wonderful park there. It's got a swale of a lovely ravine, the Glen Cedar ravine. So I would go to the beach. I would go up to Lansing. I would go to some suburban neighborhoods that are worth walking through. So yes, Rosedale is always worth seeing because at least you could put your nose to the window and see how they live. Yes. No, just kidding. But there are lots of those. There are lots of those kinds. The thing about making the neighborhoods work, and people get once they got a good neighborhood, they get very possessive, and they just as soon lock the door, not let other folks in. But the neighborhoods that really do flourish are not the ones that put up walls. They're the ones that insist on having doors and windows, because you need that exchange. Even the old village of Swansea, it never had a high school. It didn't have any Roman Catholic school. It didn't have a whole bunch of things, but we just had to walk across the road to the city of Toronto and get those services. Yeah. So there's a thing that's always worth remembering, and it's easy to forget because there's lots of people who like to put walls around, whether they're real walls or paper walls won't put on into the fight, but at any rate, a sense of region is really important. Toronto has flourished, like New York City, like other places. It's flourished by its ability to deal with its region, and its region has flourished. When both work together, they both flourish. But it's more often than not, unfortunately, cities and suburbs fight one another when absolutely all they're doing is fighting over the same family bone.
That's a great metaphor. One of my favorite places is Kensington Market, which has a rich history, and there are many walking tours in that area as well. And you just feel like you're, walking through history and getting such a different experience than just being in the downtown core, right? Which is often what visitors do, is come to our downtown spaces, and then really the Toronto is in these neighborhoods, and the history there is just amazing.
No, it really is. My wife, by the way, in long-term care is at Kensington Gardens. So I'm in Kensington almost on a daily basis, certainly 3 times a week, at least when we could get there. So you're right, it's got a wonderful history. There is one, and I think you and I talked about it. There's a book called The Making of a Global City by Robert Vipon from the University of Toronto. And it sounds like a grand title because it's really only about the history of Clinton Street Public School. And if you read that book, and I could take it to the school, and then we could go around that neighborhood, it is a story of that neighborhood from 1889 to now. And he takes you through what kind of neighborhood it was, right? So he calls it British Clinton. And then about the 1920s, he calls that Jewish Clinton. And from about the 1950s, the mid-50s, he calls it European Clinton, because it was mainly Italian Portuguese. And then when his kids went there, he called that Global Clinton. And it's one school in an institution, and yet carries with it the whole history of the impact of immigration and the impact of neighborhoods on people.
Yeah.
So there we go. Yeah.
No, that's lovely. I want to ask a bit about open spaces too, because we're talking about green spaces and ravines and waterfront. And do you think that there are enough open spaces in the city, and how do we sustain and preserve those spaces?
There aren't enough, and that's why you constantly need to have a program of acquisition, because neighborhoods also change.
Mm-hmm.
And simply because it's open space doesn't mean it's usable. So if you go through St. Lawrence neighborhood, it has very little open space, but it's well planned and well used. I can take you up to a large development, say Jamestown. That's 83% open space, and it's not used. So it's got to do not with the amount of open space. Go to Central Park if you want a sense of how the gift of Central Park to New York City is extraordinary. No, most cities have something similar, but they can't touch it. What do New Yorkers get out of that? Now, if you take a look from a plane, right, it's not a hell of a lot of space, but boy, oh boy, is it used by every kind of New Yorker you can think of. Well, in a sense, we don't have quite that. We don't have Hyde Park is closest, but it's not central, and it's pretty good, but not in the same league. So we need more open space. But for us, the great advantage we have is the one we did not take. The road we did not take in any significant productive way was to be able to use the ravines as the anchor for all of our open space. We're beginning to do that, but we need to do far more of that.
Now, there was a question about how would you describe a ravine? What is a ravine?
Oh, a ravine. Well, they're in my mind. I think they're everywhere. But anywhere where you find water, you will find a ravine, whether that's Mud Creek, right, or the Rouge River. So it's wherever there's water. That's why when we talk about the green belt, or we talk about the white belt, or the blue belt is the significant one. It deals with the groundwater. It deals with at surface water. It deals with wetlands. All of that is obviously a central part of any natural heritage. Toronto is absolutely over the top wealthy in that regard, and has been underutilized for a number of generations. It's been coming back, and it's getting better, but there we are. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to remind people you're welcome to ask questions on Facebook or Zoom if you have any questions. I'm sure David would be happy to answer them. And in the meantime, I was curious, with we've had so much development in Toronto over the last few years, and some wonderful new museums like the Aga Khan Museum. We've got a contemporary art museum that's been redeveloped. Are there other places like that, public institutions or buildings or architecturally interesting places that you would suggest people visit that, again, may not be on the regular tourist map?
Well, there are a series of small museums that are run really, I'm going to say run by, but certainly under the umbrella of the city of Toronto. And certainly they are worth it because you'll get local narratives and local neighborhood stuff. There's lots of them. There's also many, let me call them ethnic histories. So there's lots of histories of groups who came here and want to tell their story. And you'll find those in churches and synagogues and mosques, and you'll find them in freestanding buildings. People are taking a stronger interest in it, mainly because of the whole notion of diversity has become so strong a characteristic of the city. Mm-hmm. And so that's why you're finding that there's more interest in those kinds of musea. We failed, in my judgment, to have one central place, and maybe that's not possible. Whenever I'm in New York City, which is I go there for a particular reason 3 times a year for sure. I go down to the New York History Museum, not the City Museum, but the New York History Museum. That's my idea, and they do a great job of telling the story. We don't have one of those, but on the other hand, we may be onto something with Museum. because a new generation, and certainly as we're finding now in these straitened times, a digital universe is not only upon us, but it's surrounded by us and sucking us in. So having a museum, have a museum or a museum that is devoted not only to having a central physical place, which is what my museum is trying to do, but also serves a digital generation, serves a new world where you can tap into it almost at any time on your little phone. That's marvelous. Yeah. So I think that's why my museum is, I think, going to attract a lot of attention. There's a lot of people whose fingerprints are on it, but Diane Blake is the one who's been pushing it, and she deserves the credit. So whatever they build, whatever building, I hope there's at least a Diane Blake Hall somewhere.
She is amazing. Yeah, perseverant, I would say.
Absolutely.
Who would you say is your favorite Torontonian if you were to look back into history? Or, it's a tricky question for now, but
well, no, it's not. I mean, I don't have any. I've been lucky enough to. I've been lucky enough. I've been lucky enough to read many of them. Knew a number, at least in the last couple of generations, and read a lot on the history of Toronto, even when it wasn't a kind of normal or popular thing to do. I can't find one, and in some ways, I'm delighted I can't, because the history of Toronto is not about the history of great men or women. They made the great contributions, should be noted, and see what they did, and so on. So, and there were lots and lots of those. I wouldn't choose one, but we should not forget that the history of the city is the history of people coming here to try and make something out of their lives and for themselves and their kids. It's no more complicated than that. So the heroes, they're the mums and dads.
That's nice.
They are.
I think I've told you.
Sorry.
Go ahead, David. Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
I'm fine. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think I've told you I'm a rare person in Toronto, which is probably 6th or 7th generation Torontonian. My relatives came over in the early 1800s and settled on farms and.
Whereabouts? They came to where?
Some in Oshawa, and then
okay.
My great grandfather, actually, I just found out, is buried in the cemetery in the Beaches. So I'm going to go take a visit there soon.
Oh, it just reminded me. Years ago, when you filed your income tax in Canada, you had to fill in the part that said place of origin, right? And what they meant was not you, but where your people came from. The assumption was everybody's from somewhere else. God love my mother. Her family came here in 1828 from Ireland, I think. We're not even sure. But she used to be able to proudly put in origin, Canadian. So you could probably do that. Yeah.
There's just a question that's come in off of Facebook that I think is an interesting one. Why do you think Toronto isn't more prominent as a world capital?
Part of it is a Canadian thing. If Canada, if the battle had gone differently in 1812, this might be the United States. So maybe it would have fared differently. But it was part of Canada, and Canada was part of the British Empire for such a long time. And our business was not to sort of extol the virtues of us. It was to sort of as Canadians, but us as part of the British Empire. That died certainly by the time you get to the end of World War II. It was already limping by the end of World War I. But that was our story up until that time. Secondly, we were shaded by Montreal in many ways, because Montreal was the better known city and an earlier city, and all of that. Thirdly, there's always my own view. Thirdly, is we've nurtured generations of people who think that part of their starting point is to point out how crummy things are in Toronto, so they can fix it. Right? And so we've given a lot to both fiction writers and academic writers who basically would like to show how quite dark it's been, and therefore there's no been extolling. Even to this day, if you stand up, I used to be able to tell jokes saying, but listen, I'm from Toronto, and our one contribution is that we make sure there's unity in the country because everybody hates us. So it's that kind of note. Now that has begun to change, and I'm beginning to worry because people thinking, gee, we're pretty good. And that's the beginning of the denouement.
Yeah. Well, I think we do have a lot to be proud of, for sure.
Oh, no, for sure. But and I must say, well, look, Peter Zosky was a great Canadian broadcaster and journalist, and he had a morning show in CBC. This is a true story. And he, one year, 20 years ago, he had this contest as Canadian as fill in blank. Canadian as maple syrup, Canadian as maple leaf, whatever.
Beer, bacon, yeah.
But you know what won? As Canadian as possible under the circumstances. And every Canadian gets that.
Yeah, totally. I'm interested. Do our friends in the States understand that, or is that just a Canadian?
No, they don't. They don't because no, we do because it's a more modesty, and it is a cliche too. And maybe it is a cliche, but like cliches they're not bad. They usually carry some truth. Americans have pursued life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is fantastic. It's swaggering. The equivalent in Canada at the top of our Constitution says ours is not peace order. Ours is peace, order, and good government, which is pretty boring. Yes. On the other hand, it's stable. On the other hand, there's a kind of middle groundedness about it. There is a thing that says, where's the vital middle? That's our goal. And it used to be the joke, why does a Canadian cross the road? To get to the middle.
Yeah, that's another one.
So
I don't know if you're helping us here or not, but
I'm not at all. I'm not at all. But there is beneath all of that, I have no doubt about it, a kind of arrogant little pride that we all carry.
I think so.
Yeah.
There are just a few more questions that are coming in. It's kind of an odd one, but if you could go 100 years into the future, what would you imagine Toronto might look like or might be like?
Well, I think a couple of things. A couple of things. I work on a thing now that I made recommendations for Toronto to from 2020 to 2041 to the provincial government. So that part, first of all, it should be making sure that it continues to have an economic base. People very often forget, they take it for granted that somehow you have an economic base. Well, in the worlds I've been in, if you don't have an economic base, you can have all the fantasies and dreams you like. So dealing with what's going. So we need to always make sure we're keeping what we've got of the old base if we can, but really working hard, get a good chunk of the new base that's coming along. And I think we're doing that in the digital world, for example, or IT or whatever it might be. But it also needs to continue to be a place where there's a sense of welcome, even if it's grudging, but a sense of openness, right? That says everybody here has a right to be here. And if you don't think that's true, go somewhere else, right? I mean, that is really important. And thirdly, I really hope that we grab hold of our natural heritage, because in the 21st century, by the end of it, the places that will survive are those that have taken care of their natural heritage.
Yeah, I often think we spend too much time comparing ourselves, and we just need to own what we've got. So there's lots here.
Oh no, for sure. I do work in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the region around Toronto. It's the fastest growing region in North America. It's got enormous human and natural resources. So, yeah.
One other question came in around books. So just in learning more about Toronto, and I think we could extend that to movies and films and things. What would you suggest is good resources to learn more about Toronto?
I would go to our fiction writers first of all. I mean, whoever they might be. Uh, um, Margaret Atwood for sure. Margaret Atwood is. They're going to have stoplights saying Margaret says stop. You know, she's become Saint Margaret, but she understands the city, and she understands its natural heritage as well, and she writes about the ravines. But that's also so. I would go to the fiction writers, look them up. There's lots of them. But I would go to them because they deal with the kind of reality that they don't that they well I just go to the fiction writers. Secondly, the man named Levine has brought a book out recently simply called Toronto. Wonderful book. I would read Robert Vipon's book. There's a lot of new books coming out. If you're looking for anything to get a sense of where what might be on offer, both in essays, and books, whatever, go over to the little wee store at 401 Richmond Street, which is by Spadina. And on the far end of that building from Spadina, close to Peter Street, you'll see a little wee store called Spacing.
Right.
And it's a little wee place, but anything that's worthwhile that you might want to get about Toronto, you can get out of Spacing.
Yeah, I do. All my stocking stuffers there.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Okay.
It's a wonderful store.
It really is. And actually there's this great story of the building itself. That was the dream of Margie Zeidler and the Zeidler family. They turned that into a seedbed of new thinking about Toronto and about social issues and political issues. And it's a story of one family pushing that really hard. You know, so it's even a great story while you're shopping.
Yeah. You also, I think, are a fan of the National Film Board and some of their.
I am. The National Film Board has done a lot of good work at whatever incredible cost to the federal government, but for over the years they've done a really good job. They're very underrated, and they forgot to add a promotion department when they invented it. And so you have to almost by word of mouth, you have to find out that they've got a wonderful array of old films and stuff because they're part of that whole early 30s and 40s and 50s CBC crowd. So they were very earnest in what they were doing, and they really tried to capture the moment. And they're always sort of on the upswing of Canada's just getting better, folks. So there's a nice optimism ordinarily about it, but people would do well just to check with them and see what they're digging up from their own cellar.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think we're going to close in just a minute, but I want to make sure there's some nice comments coming in on Zoom. If you have any questions on Facebook, let us know. But I am curious. You know, we're living in an interesting time here, and we talk a lot about resiliency when we travel, and how do we develop resiliency? Because obviously, being a woman traveler, and many of our audience are solo travelers and females. How do we develop resiliency? And I'm curious what you think in terms of how can a city help us develop resiliency, and how can cities become more resilient given what's going on right now with both civil rights discussions and in a health crisis that we're in the middle of. What would be your advice to stay optimistic and help us become stronger?
Oh, I'm not sure how, if you're traveling, you can be resilient. I don't really know how to answer that question, but staying optimistic, I don't have much difficulty. You have to remember that everything changes. I mean, it seemed like obviously, but we forget that things change. Right now, for example, someone asked me, America's falling apart, right? The pandemic and the race stuff and the streets and the Trump and all of that stuff. And I sent a note saying, they said, well, what would you do? And I said, first of all, you got to get rid of Trump. I know that's impolitic for me to say this, but the guy just is not up to the job, and he's hurting things. He's hurting people, and he's hurting opportunities. He hurts us. Don't forget, and anything dumb being done in the States, we get wind of it pretty fast. So changing the leadership, but that won't fix a lot of things. It'll just give you an opportunity to do it. So I sent a note saying, you know, years ago when we were trying to change people's understanding of what life was about in Toronto, we had, like they did in many other parts of North America, we had teach-ins, right? And we used to sort of have these jackdaw kits, assemble information, have people talk about them. What they need to do, I think, in the States, if I was the president, the new president,
here's the question.
I'd say we are going to spawn, we're going to spawn a network of teach-ins, local, neighborhood, local, city, region, state, federal government. Why? Because we can't listen to academics and learned people and politicians simply saying, here we think is the best. They really do need to have an earlier discussion and let it bubble up, pass resolutions, and then see what comes out of that. There'll be all kinds of ways in which people will see it, because at the heart of it, the American story is a human story. It's a story of humanity. It didn't do a good job in a number of ways, but it did a hell of a good job in a number of other ways. So it needs to find its rebirth. And so you can do that only by asking people to think about it, talk about it, pass some resolutions, pass them on, try and put them into policy, which puts them into legislation, which also puts them, however, more importantly, into attitudinal change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So every time, sorry, David.
No.
So when you hear a piece of news that is disparaging, what do you do to stay optimistic and rise above?
Oh yeah, I just if I'm disturbed by it myself, I try and do something about it. But I have to. You can't spend your life just solving everybody else's problems. So yeah, I say, here's what I'm doing, and within that, I can do this. I keep optimistic because I have a great faith that people will restore. People will, not necessarily people. They need a new start, maybe whatever it might be. But people always need to make it better. What changes it? Kids change it.
Yeah.
I mean, I can remember when my firstborn. You don't have to have a kid to get that way, but that's what promotes people. But I looked down at her. She was 6 pounds 4 ounces, and I remember saying to my brother, "Davey, get your ass in gear. you get going, pal." So that leads to restoration. And I think remember that it's a rebirth. America's got a better ability to do that than most countries. But most countries have their own ways of doing it. I spent time in that Scandinavia a little bit because part of my family is Norwegian. 2 of my grandchildren born and raised. So they've done wonderful things in those countries. Every country has a story. But the American story is, to me, a special one that's been squandered too often, but it's got the ability to do it right.
Yeah, I think that's a great place for us to end, actually. So thank you for that. Those
I enjoyed
very
it.
Wise words. We're going to publish an article after this with all of the books and the movies and other tips from David. So just to let you know, that will be on the JourneyWoman website, hopefully later this week. And I want to thank David very much for his insight and his generosity in doing this with us today and helping me kick off this first in a series. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Carolyn. You take care.
If anybody here has a city that they'd like us to focus on, please send me an email at editor@journeywoman.com, and we'll do our best to look into that and find people just like David to give us some insights. And I hope that those of you listening can join us in our upcoming events, our book clubs, which I mentioned earlier, and our ethical travel session, which will be held in a few weeks. And all of that information is on our website and on Facebook. So again, thank you, David. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I hope it brought some new perspective into how we can look at our own cities and enjoy the time we have to get to know something that we may not know so well. So this is a special time for all of us. So thank you, and stay safe, stay well. Bye.
Bye.